Yes, sir.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Radio Free Cannabis, coming to you from high in the hills of Oakland, California, translated into 190 different languages and connected to a worldwide network of activist correspondents. We are the voice of the global cannabis freedom movement, and I am your host, Steve DeAngelo. That movement, the movement to liberate the most valuable plant on the planet, and the people who love that plant from centuries of oppression, continues to build power, momentum, and public support almost everywhere in the world. But the progress is spotty. It's uneven, it's far too slow, and in many places around the world, members of our tribe, some of the most gentle people on earth, are still being arrested, publicly humiliated, injured, imprisoned, and in some cases, losing their lives to the enforcers of prohibition. Our feature reports this episode from New York, Colombia, Germany, and Austria will document both the encouraging progress that cannabis activists are making and the heartbreaking tragedies our tribe is still suffering through. First, some headlines from the past few weeks. The tragic story of Sha'Carri Richardson focused the world's attention on the absurdity of penalizing athletes for using cannabis while allowing the use of alcohol and prescription drugs that are far more dangerous. Sha'Carri, a bold and charismatic Olympic sprinter who was well positioned for a possible gold medal, was removed from the U.S. Olympic team on July 6th after testing positive for cannabis use, even though International Olympics officials said she would still be allowed to compete in Tokyo. President Biden, apparently unable to resist any opportunity to throw shade on cannabis, supported Sha'Carri's suspension with the completely meaningless observation that the rules are the rules. Well, thanks, Joe. We hadn't realized that yet. Sha'Carri publicly apologized for disappointing her fans, but we here at Radio Free Cannabis believe Sha'Carri is the one that has been wronged, and that she is the one that's owed an apology. The real blame here lies with the U.S. Olympic team officials who decided to suspend Sha'Carri for using a substance that is legal in the majority of the United States and has been scientifically proven to be safe and effective for the recovery of athletes. Shame on them. 10 years from now, the absurdity of their actions will be crystal clear. But in the meantime, the United States has lost an almost sure shot at an Olympic gold medal, and Sha'Carri has lost a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and potentially millions of dollars just for making the safest and healthiest choice, both for her and for society. Highlighting this injustice, barely a week later, U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer filed a comprehensive bill to legalize cannabis at the federal level. Schumer's bill, while problematic in many regards, would entirely remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act and create an Office of Cannabis Justice to ensure equity and diversity in the industry. These would be remarkably progressive steps from a federal government that to this day still denies that there are even any valid medical uses for the plant. But don't get excited yet. Most observers rate the Schumer bill's chances of passage by the Senate as very slim. Federal legalization in the United States is still probably several years in the future. The beginning of the month of July saw the U.S. state of Connecticut become the latest of several northeastern states to pass adult use legalization. Unlike the neighboring state of New York, which has stated its intention to create a pathway for traditional cannabis business people from the legacy market to enter the legal market, Connecticut seems to be moving in the opposite direction, prohibiting anybody with felony cannabis convictions from participating in the regulated industry. With passage of Connecticut's law, cannabis is now legal for adults in 21 U.S. states and territories. As we go to air towards the end of July, the Latin American nation of Colombia is imminently expected to announce the beginning of legal cannabis flower exports. The production and export of extracted cannabis oil for medical purposes has been legal in Colombia for several years, and the addition of whole flower exports is expected to very substantially increase the growth of Colombia's legal cannabis industry. If Colombia can manage to tame the corruption and violence of its armed forces and continues to reform its cannabis laws, it would be well positioned to be among the world's lowest cost nations for cannabis. In the United States, cultivation costs from 50 cents to $1 per gram, compared to around 5 cents per gram in Colombia. Well, the world sure could use more good, clean, low-cost cannabis. Ireland has become the latest European country to see a wickedly dangerous synthetic cannabinoid known as MDMB4EN Pinaca hit the unregulated underground cannabis market. This vile substance, cooked up by sleazoid chemists, then sprayed on hemp flowers or low-grade cannabis by criminal gangs to stretch their profits, has been linked to 3 deaths in the UK and 1 death in Sweden, along with 11 other reported cases of poisoning that required hospitalization. These deaths and poisonings are the direct consequence of prohibition. The only reason most cannabis consumers buy and ingest this contaminated product is because they don't know the chemicals have been sprayed on it. The best way to put the criminals who are distributing dangerous synthetic cannabis products out of business is to displace them with good, clean, affordable, natural cannabis. This would happen rapidly and automatically with zero enforcement effort by the government if one simple step were taken. Legalize cannabis for all adult uses in Ireland and the UK and Sweden and everywhere in the world. One of the main things standing in the way of that goal are ongoing efforts by the prohibitionists to muddy the waters of debate by advancing shaky, supposedly quote-unquote scientific studies that make a variety of sensational claims about cannabis that have already been thoroughly and repeatedly disproven and debunked. Their latest campaign was launched in late July with simultaneous and highly inaccurate news stories on American media giants CBS, CNN, and Fox. These stories, apparently timed to influence the debate about the Schumer bill, variously claimed that modern cannabis is an entirely different and much more dangerous product than what our grandparents consumed, that cannabis use increases the incidence of insanity, and that huge numbers of American children are consuming cannabis edibles and being poisoned by them. All of these stories are demonstrably untrue, as they have been untrue for the past 5 decades, when some version or another, one ridiculous claim or another, has been advanced by prohibitionists desperate to find some justification for their ongoing campaign against the most valuable plant on the planet. We've been chipping away at their lives for a long time now, like water dripping on a stone. Sometimes progress is very slow, and sometimes it's more rapid. But for those of us who love the plant, there's no other option but to keep on dripping and keep on chipping until nothing is left of this mountain of lies. I'm going to close us out of the headlines now on a cheery note with an example of the kind of new freedoms our collective work is bringing forth into the world. Today, airports in New York State, as a direct consequence of that state's recent legalization law, have announced they will no longer seize cannabis found in travelers' luggage or have those travelers arrested. For those of us who have been hauled out of airports in handcuffs, as I have been twice in my career, this is a huge relief. I don't think I'm ever going to entirely get rid of the PTSD those 2 incidents caused me, but it's nice to know that at least in New York, I'm not likely to suffer a repeat experience. But do be aware, friends, there's a limit to the generosity of the state of New York, and that limit is 3 ounces of cannabis. More than that, and you still risk the handcuffs. So be careful as you enjoy these wonderful new freedoms that we've brought about with our love and our determination. We turn now to our global network of activist correspondents for more of that love and determination. We'll stay in New York for our first story from the ever-ready and always knowledgeable Bill Weinberg, coming to us from the legendary Tompkins Square Park in the East Village of New York City.
Thanks, Steve. Well, here I am standing in the hallowed grounds of Tompkins Square Park, which is really an unacknowledged birthplace of so much radical history, counterculture history, and cannabis history, which has really affected all of the United States and even the world. The very first smoke-in America, to the best of my knowledge, was held here in Tompkins Square Park in December of 1964, convened by Allen Ginsberg, the famous beatnik poet, and Peter Orlovsky, his collaborator and lover. And they actually they smoked in public here in Tompkins Square Park in December of 1964, and they held a little rally over at the city welfare office, which at that time was over on Avenue B, demanding legalization. And of course, people who are familiar with counterculture history will know that Ginsberg was kind of a torchbearer. He kind of passed on the flame from the beatniks to the hippies, and then out of the hippies came the yippies. The yippies were like the political activist hippies who got organized to protest the war in Vietnam and to advocate for cannabis legalization. And Ginsberg was involved with them as well when they launched the first big smoke-ins, which became a regular ongoing affair here in New York City and around the country and around the world. In 1973, they started the big pot parade, which has been going on ever since then. Today it's called the Cannabis March. And back then it was a very radical, kind of anarchistic counterculture affair. The fact that we just had one back in May here in New York City up at Union Square now, where Chuck Schumer spoke, the Senate Majority Leader, just shows how far we've come and how, this once extremely radical counterculture, anarchistic kind of ethic has now been embraced by the mainstream. But there's been a lot of water under the bridge in the intervening years, that's for sure. And among the other things which happened in Tompkins Square Park during all those long years is, well, for starters, in 1967, just 3 years after the first smoke-in, you had the 1967 Tompkins Square Park riot, the hippie riot, so to speak, where there were a bunch of hippies hanging out in the park. Back then, you can either call it the Lower East Side or the East Village. The hippies started calling it the East Village because the beatniks got priced out of Greenwich Village by rising rents in the early 1960s, came east here to the Lower East Side where the rents were cheaper. That's what gave the area the cachet for alternative culture, which is what attracted the hippies. So just like in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, you had the whole hippie scene happening here in the East Village during that same period. And on Memorial Day of 1967, there was a big spontaneous party going on here in Tompkins Square Park with hippies strumming on guitars and Puerto Ricans beating on conga drums, having a lot of fun and making a lot of noise. And some of the older neighborhood residents called the police to complain about the noise. The police came in, tried to break up the party, and of course everybody ignored them. Then they started trying to grab guitars. People locked arms and refused to be moved. The police started using the nightsticks, and that turned into the first Tompkins Square Park riot of the 20th century. There had been earlier ones back in the 1800s. And after that, the politics got a lot harsher. Openly revolutionary groups began to emerge, particularly the Young Lords, who were kind of like the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers also had a presence here, as did the Diggers and the Provos and the Yippies and other kind of like hippie anarchist street fighting gangs which began to emerge. Then you move into the 1970s. The drugs began to change. The hippies had brought in marijuana and LSD. In the 1970s, organized crime got in on the act, and they flooded the neighborhood with cocaine and heroin. Then you had the urban blight, landlord arson, and abandonment. By the time I started hanging out in this neighborhood, in the late 70s, early 80s, it was really kind of a rough neighborhood. And Tompkins Square was, by that point, something of a no-go zone. You didn't come into this park unless you wanted to buy drugs, and I don't mean pot, I mean dangerous drugs, or get mugged. And that began to change due to again, not due to some intervention from the city fathers from on high, but a grassroots initiative from below. And the big turning point year was 1988, when the homeless actually established an encampment in the park. And August 6, 1988, when they first tried to impose a 1 a.m. curfew, Tompkins Square exploded into a huge riot, the one we still call today the Tompkins Square Park riot, although there were many before, and there's been quite a few since. That was the beginning of the 3 years that we call the class war period on the Lower East Side, when there was a whole series of really angry protests and riots, which finally ended in 1991 when the park was closed by decree of the mayor's office, and we didn't have a park in this neighborhood for 2 years. And when the park reopened, the curfew was actually enforced. It's a midnight curfew now. We're an hour earlier than the original one, just to salt in our wounds. And there is a certain sense that the cycle is coming around yet again, because it's very strange. There's really this, unprecedented atmosphere, really, since the Black Lives Matter uprising of last year. There's been this unprecedented atmosphere of freedom in the city. And I would say, I can certainly feel it. And with the passage of MRTA back in March, you can actually smoke in public on the city streets in New York. In fact, anywhere in New York State, all the way up to the northern Adirondacks and Niagara Falls. So, but at the same time, there's kind of a backlash going on. And due to the extremely loud and exuberant party scene with a lot of public smoking, I will add, in Washington Square Park over in Greenwich Village, the city has once again decided to make the curfew earlier. They actually tried to enforce a 10 p.m. curfew in Washington Square Park a couple of weeks ago, and on June 5th, there actually was a little riot in Washington Square Park when the police tried to impose a 10 p.m. curfew, and a bunch of people were arrested. So there's this strange sense of cycles coming around again, and I anticipate that if they attempt to do that here in Tompkins Square, there could be trouble. So hopefully they will not attempt to do that. But in any event, it feels like it's a very interesting, fertile time here in New York City, which is just pregnant with possibility. And I would say that this particular piece of turf that I'm standing on, Tompkins Square Park, is going to be a key point to watch in the months and the years to come. For Radio Free Cannabis, this has been Bill Weinberg of the Global Ganja Report.
Thank you, Bill, for that tour into the past and future of the New York City cannabis tribe. I'm very happy to be able to bring some of this mostly lost and hidden history to light for the Radio Free Cannabis audience. The leading role that California's played in the cannabis freedom movement is well known all around the world. But in fact, New York has played almost just as important a role, especially in the early days of the movement. It was the place where many of the most important leaders of our movement, people like me and Ed Rosenthal and Ethan Nadelman, all got our start. So it's nice to see the city finally get some of the credit and recognition it's due. We turn next to another place that's played a critical role in the development of our culture and our tribe and our industry, the country of Colombia. This story is an initial report from a new RFC activist correspondent, Karina Palmer. Welcome to Radio Free Cannabis, Karina.
Thanks, Steve. Colombia is a country with a long history when it comes to cannabis. The reputation and quality of cannabis cultivation extends way back to indigenous and sacred use. But it's really around the 70s where it gained international notoriety when the North American cannabis traffickers made inroads into Colombia. Despite the Catholic Church's strong heritage and the legacy of the imported prohibition that dictates national law, cannabis in Colombia is legal for specific medical uses. Personal cultivation up to 20 plants as well as personal consumption, has been decriminalized since the early 90s. Cannabis remains illegal for commercial sale. However, in 1994, Colombia's Supreme Court determined that possession for personal use was legal. I had the opportunity to discuss this and a few topics with Julian Quintero. He's a Colombian leader who is helping to reshape the understanding of drug policy and working closely with government agencies in the restructuring of drug policy in the country. How is law enforced in Colombia in terms of possession? What happens if someone is detained with more than 20 grams, which is the allowance?
Partiendo de que Colombia permite la dosis mínima, ya también hay un desarrollo jurisprudencial que dice que no importa la cantidad que lleve, siempre y cuando usted pueda demostrar que esa cantidad es para su uso recreativo o medicinal, es altamente probable que las próximas regulaciones legislativas, como sea, decreto, leyes, jurisprudencia, respeten estos elementos que ya se han hecho. Es decir, que básicamente antes de cuánto va a llevar usted encima, lo que usted tiene que probar es que eso que lleva es para su uso personal. Para el año 1994, en desarrollo de una nueva constitución que nació en Colombia en el 91, es una constitución más liberal, es una constitución más secularizada y incluye un capítulo y es el artículo llamado del libre desarrollo de la personalidad. Un magistrado dice que no solamente basta con el libre desarrollo de la personalidad, sino que también hay que reconocer el porte y consumo de la dosis mínima. Y en ese año se fija para Colombia la dosis mínima de marihuana, que es de 20 gramos. Al 94, donde apenas el mundo estaba empezando a ver los primeros puntadas de regulación y la ven mucho a través del uso medicinal, pues aparece un señor diciendo, en Colombia puedes llevar 20 gramos de marihuana, que eso es mucho, todavía es mucho, ¿no? La persecución de la policía, entre el libre desarrollo de la personalidad, entre la dosis mínima, todos estos puntos de vista empiezan a competir y ya hacia el año 2007 en Colombia nace la primera política pública para la prevención del consumo de sustancias psicoactivas desde la perspectiva de la salud pública, ¿no? El día de hoy, ya hace 4 años en Colombia, se creó la primera ley para la producción y comercialización del cannabis medicinal. Y en este momento tenemos un proyecto de ley en el Congreso de la República para la regulación del cannabis recreativo o para uso adulto, que ya pasó primer debate y ahorita a partir del 20 de julio iniciará el segundo debate.
How does the general public perceive cannabis and the cannabis movement in this new road towards legalization?
Colombia está viviendo la transición que han vivido muchos países de un prejuicio y una negación frente a las propiedades medicinales y terapéuticas del cannabis. Creo que cuando el gobierno abre la puerta para dialogar de cannabis, salen a flote todas aquellas personas que han tenido un acercamiento al cannabis, pero que por alguna manera lo han negado o por ley, o por moral, o por religión, ¿no? Que todas las viejitas siempre tenían una botella con alcohol y marihuana en su casa para los dolores. Creo que esas dos historias están juntándose y si tú comparas qué pensaban de regulación de hace 10 años ahora, ha bajado de cerca del 85% que se lo negaban al 55% y creo que es lo que el mundo está viviendo, que junta esos dos extremos de la interpretación.
Why do you think this process is taking so long?
El prohibicionismo ha hecho muy bien la tarea en hacerle pensar a las personas que la culpa es de la sustancia y no de la prohibición. Todo lo ponen en la misma bolsa, marihuana, cocaína, pasta base, heroína. Muchas personas han sufrido las consecuencias de la prohibición y sobre todo de personas mayores, que son las que más sufrieron, por ejemplo, en la época de Pablo Escobar. Cualquier manifestación del tema de drogas en Colombia se asocia con las bombas y los asesinatos de la época de Pablo Escobar, ¿no?
So there's a big set of news announced for Monday, July 19th. I would like you to walk us a little bit through that and what it means.
Como siempre hemos sido un país del tercer mundo que solamente produce materia prima para que el primer mundo la vuelva excelentes productos. En Colombia, cuando se reguló el cannabis, no se permitía la venta de la flor seca. Solamente se ha permitido la venta de los aceites. Pues parece que el día lunes a las 11 de la mañana, el presidente de la República, en una de las empresas de marihuana que más ha impulsado la flor seca, hará el anuncio y por fin, después de 2 años de empujar y de 4 años de ley, va a decir, ahora sí se puede vender la flor seca en Colombia.
What kind of relationship is the current relationship between Colombia and the United States?
Yo lamento mucho, pero en las personas que son víctimas de la guerra contra las drogas, a los jóvenes que son perseguidos o a los campesinos que son perseguidos, están cultivando un resentimiento frente a las políticas norteamericanas porque no conciben que mientras allá permiten el cultivo, permiten la venta, permiten todo, aquí haya personas que vayan a la cárcel, que sean muertas por una política prohibicionista de drogas impuestas por los norteamericanos. Sí es algo lo que uno pediría más, como más en el ámbito político, una flexibilización más hacia la guerra contra las drogas, que nosotros somos los que la sufrimos y la vivimos.
Thank you so much, Julian, for accepting this invitation. This is Karina Palmer of Compassion Cannabis reporting for Radio Free Cannabis. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Karina. That was a great initial report, and I think Julian is 100% correct. It's beyond outrageous that with the majority of states in the United States now allowing some form of legal cannabis sales, the people of Colombia and Mexico and other countries around the world are still suffering and dying at the hands of the American-sponsored and funded war on drugs. In the United States, people like former Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives John Boehner, who was one of the main supporters of the war on drugs, today are legally making millions of dollars from cannabis. Meanwhile, thousands of people continue to be displaced, imprisoned, and killed in Colombia. It's wrong, it's disgusting, it's criminal, and all I can say to my friends in Colombia and Mexico and the other places that are still suffering is that we here in the United States will continue our struggle until all of these laws, local, state, federal, all of them, all of the laws that support this madness and violence are finally tossed into the dustbin of history where they belong. We'll hear next from Nyke, reporting on the latest developments in Germany and Austria. This is another initial report from a brand new RFC activist correspondent, and I need to say at this point how happy I am that so many RFC viewers have been inspired to become correspondents, to bring us stories of what's going on in their country and their cities. It's another example of how rapidly and widely our movement is growing, spreading all around the globe. Nyke, welcome to Radio Free Cannabis.
Thank you, Steve, and hello from Germany. We've got good news and bad news. But let's start with the basics. So basically, cannabis is mostly illegal in Germany, meaning the grow, the harvesting, the sale, the purchase, possession, it's all illegal. One exception is the consumption. And in most cases, if you are found with only low quantities, with only personal possession, that won't be taken to trial. Also, since 2017, medical cannabis is legal in Germany. But it's not that easy at all to qualify as a patient. First of all, you have to find a doctor who knows about the endocannabinoid system, or who accepts cannabis as an alternative medicine. And even then, only few medical disorders qualify in the eyes of doctors and insurances as valid for medical cannabis. Leaving people with medical disorders, for example, like depression, PTSD, and anxiety, with mostly no way of getting a prescription or having to pay all the cost themselves, so the insurance not covering the cost for their medicine. Just so you understand, medical cannabis is 2 to 4 times more expensive than cannabis on a black market. This forces a big part of society to depend on the black market, which can actually bring a better quality than medical cannabis, but in worst case, leave them with something very bad, namely stretched weed. This stretched weed it's assumed that around 10 to 20% of the black market is with stretched weed, and this means that they use synthetic cannabinoids, or for example, even lead, to make it heavier and to stretch it. So we take a perfectly good healing plant and force people who want to heal to use possibly something that will even make them sick. But we also got some good news. It's the election year this year, and 4 out of the 6 biggest parties in Germany are in any sort pro-adult use legalization. We will have to see if this is only voter catching. And, in any ways, we have to keep in mind that we don't just applaud any sort of legalization, but fight for a fair market and fight for the people who are convicted because of cannabis. What we know for sure is that it will take some time until we have an adult use legalization over here. And so far, the situation against consumers, growers, entrepreneurs is drastic. Let me give you 2 examples. Hussein Khalaf was a perfectly healthy 19-year-old boy who died after a violent police attack on him because he smoked a joint. So what happened is that Hussein and his friend were smoking a joint in a park when police came. He panicked, ran away, police ran after him and forced him violently to the ground, using violence and pepper spray. An ambulance was called as it's normal when pepper spray is in use, and Hussein was telling them that he wasn't feeling well at all, that he couldn't breathe. Still, the ambulance left, leaving him with the police, who took him into custody, where he later collapsed and finally then died in hospital. We have to keep in mind that we're talking about a healthy, perfectly healthy young boy over here, who was doing nothing wrong, only smoking a joint. And keep in mind, the consumption of cannabis isn't illegal. Family and friends are fighting for justice for Kusai. As far as I know, they will probably make a petition because the situation doesn't look too good and police is denying everything. Soon as I know more about the petition, I will give you the news so we can fight worldwide for justice for Kusai. Another example are CBD shops. So our main court, our highest court, the Court of Justice, the Federal Court of Justice, just ruled that CBD buds aren't illegal as far as they are run from legal hemp, meaning that THC has to be under 0.2%. Although this rule, police is still raiding CBD shops in the middle of pandemic, taking all their stuff and even frightening them with sentences from minimum 1 year in jail. Basically, these are the news, a quick glance from Germany. So we are fighting. Some things are getting better, but still it's a long way. Before the end, let me give you a quick glance into our neighborhood country, namely Austria. 3 men were sentenced to 9, 8.5, and 3 years in prison for growing, harvesting, and helping to harvest cannabis. These men were totally normal men, doing normal jobs, having family, never before having anything to do with justice. Still, they got this very harsh sentence, which is comparable to sentences for homicide and even higher than the average sentence for child abuse. Please keep in mind that these men wanted to do nothing wrong, just to help people with a healing plant. Justice for Hemp is fighting for a shorter sentence. You can find a petition on change.org and you can help with your signature from wherever in the world you are to fight for these 3 men. Thank you so much. This was Nyke from Germany for Radio Free Cannabis.
Thank you, Nyke. That was a great first report, and you delivered it in a remarkably calm tone of voice, given the deeply disturbing nature of the news you reported. What a horrifying series of events from the heart of the continent, Europe, that most likes to hold itself out as the world's best example of sophistication, civilization, science, and democracy. Yet here are these stories of perfectly decent citizens going about their lives, earning their livings, not harming a soul, just doing the kinds of things all human beings should be allowed to do, being yanked out of public parks and chased down and murdered by police, or dying and being hospitalized from poisoned underground product, or peaceful cannabis growers being hunted down like vicious criminals and given the kind of prison sentences normally reserved for murderers or child abusers. This is Europe? Really? The same Europe that looks down its nose at the rest of the world? Well, in my view as an American, Europe is also best remembered for colonialism, slavery, and genocide. But setting all that history aside for a moment, the current blindness and inaction of Europe and its High Court of Justice regarding these true cannabis crimes means they've certainly forfeited any moral authority that they might have ever had claim to in the first place, and that moral authority will remain forfeit until full cannabis freedom and justice is a reality across all of Europe. If Europe wants to hold itself up as a paragon of human rights, it's about time for the EU bureaucrats in Brussels to start walking their own talk. In any case, all of us here in the cannabis tribe have learned that these sorts of turns and twists, this sort of posturing and posing, all these steps forward and all these steps backward, the uneven nature of progress, it's all just part of the movement and the cause that we've committed our lives to. No matter what happens from day to day, our tribe will continue to do what we've done for the past half-century. We'll wake up happy every day, knowing in our hearts that our cause is just, and in the end, we will prevail. And through each one of our days, no matter how challenged we may be, we'll do all we can to tell the truth about cannabis and to encourage others to embrace that truth, and to make sure that all of our sisters and brothers still in prison are released. And all the while, we'll do our best to stop and smell the flowers, to appreciate all the gifts Mother Nature has blessed us with, to dance joyously with each other through this precious life, to spread as much love and healing and compassion as we know how to do. And that's what we're going to keep on doing until we get all the way home to the world we really want to live in, the world that we know really is possible. I'm going to sign off now. But before I go, I want to speak directly to those of you in difficult circumstances. Remember, no matter how challenging your life is at the present moment, as long as you love cannabis, you'll never be alone. There's hundreds of millions of us now, and we've all had the same experiences with this plant. We've all learned the same lessons, and we've all developed the same value system. Chief among those values is love and loyalty. So know this: we will never forget about you, we will never abandon you, and we will not stop and we will not rest until cannabis is completely free everywhere on this planet, until every cannabis prisoner comes home to their family, and until all of us who love this plant have an honored place in our families and our societies. Until I see you next, remember to be proud of who you are and the work that we're doing together. Stay strong and be well.